Hello, fellow teachers, and welcome to Teaching with Power. My name is Ben Wilcox, and I'd like to welcome you to our study or lesson prep for Mosiah chapter 29 to Alma 4 this week. My goal is to help you teach or study the Scriptures with more relevancy and power. Now, if you'd like the lesson plans or PowerPoint slides or handouts that I use in this lesson, just go to teachingwithpower.com, and you're going to find links to my channel, my blog, and my shop. So grab your scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. We're going to start with a little matching activity. How well do you know different types of government? I'm going to give you a list, and then you tell me which description matches that particular form of government. So here we go. You've got dictatorship, theocracy, monarchy, democracy, totalitarian, and anarchy. Dictatorship, that is D. Rule by a single leader who has not been elected and may use force to keep control. A theocracy is C. Rule by leaders who lead based on a set of religious beliefs or principles. A monarchy, the match is A. Rule by a king or queen that has absolute power. That power is passed along through family. Democracy is E. Rule by representatives chosen by the majority of the people, usually for a set period of time. Totalitarian is F. Rule by a single political party. People are forced to do what the government tells them. And then finally, what's anarchy? Anarchy is a situation in which there is no government ruling. So that would be B. And this little activity I'll make available as a handout if you'd like to use that as a teacher. But how did you do? This week, we're going to get a little political. Government plays a major role in our lives, and as such, you'd imagine that the Lord might have something to say about it. And He does. The Book of Mormon contains some wonderful principles of good government, as well as the Doctrine and Covenants. And what's nice is that it's fairly nonpartisan. I found that there's principles in the Scriptures that political conservatives will most likely find challenging, and principles that political liberals will most likely find challenging. And I'm not going to attempt to paint the teachings here according to my own political leanings, or to try to mask the principles either in an effort to be politically correct. I'm just going to do my best to present what I feel the Scriptures are teaching. So, in Mosiah chapter 29, we're going to look for and identify principles of good government. We're going to go over a few together, but just know that there are others in the chapter as well. Keep your eyes open for them. And this chapter begins with King Mosiah facing a political problem. None of his 4 sons want to be the next king. They've decided to build up a different kingdom instead, the kingdom of God. They plan to go out and preach the gospel to the Lamanites. Mosiah's solution is to completely overhaul their political system from a monarchy to a more representative form of government, a government made up of judges. And that leads us to our first question. What is the best form of government, according to the Scriptures? The answer may surprise you. Look for it in Mosiah chapter 29, verse 13. And then, you can also check out Alma's view on the subject back in Mosiah chapter 23, verse 8, when his people attempted to make him a king. And the best form of government? Righteous kings. A righteous monarchy. And you can probably guess why. If you have a righteous man whose judgment is according to God's will, who isn't power hungry, and who has the best interest of the people at heart instead of himself, how amazing would it be to have a leader like that, completely in charge? How quickly could things get done? Righteous decisions could be made and implemented at once. It's a very efficient form of government. In fact, when Christ returns to earth, what will the government be? A monarchy, with Christ as our king, the King of Kings. And the government shall be upon his shoulder, like Isaiah teaches. The people in Zarahemla have good evidence of the virtue of this system. They've been fortunate enough to have 3 great kings in a row. Mosiah the first, Benjamin, and then Mosiah the second. However, there is a very important caveat with that. Notice that in both instances in these verses, you have the word if before they come to that conclusion. And that is a really big if. If you could always have just men to be your kings, that would be the best form of government to have, righteous kings. But there are some major problems with kings. There are some mishaps of monarchy. And I want you to look in Mosiah 29, verses 16 through 18, verses 21 through 24, for what those problems are. And the first one is that all men are not just. There's no way to guarantee that you will have a righteous king. Even if you've got a righteous father who passes the kingdom on to his son, there's no guarantee that his son is going to be as good as he was. In fact, that power might go to his head. There are plenty of examples of that in the Scriptures. And then he says, how much iniquity doth one wicked king cause to be committed? All it takes is one rotten apple to mess everything up. Case in point, King Noah. Many of the people of Zarahemla know all too well the problems a bad king can bring upon his people. Also, in verses 21 through 24, we find that it's very hard to get rid of a wicked king. The only way to do it is with much bloodshed. So, as effective as monarchy can be, it's just not worth the risks. Because when it goes bad, it really goes bad, and quick, and it is incredibly difficult to recover from. So, what's the next best thing, apparently? What kind of a government is King Mosiah going to recommend and establish in Zarahemla? And it's democracy, or representative government. Apparently, this is the best form of government when you can't guarantee righteous kings. I also like what Winston Churchill once said. He said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And yeah, democracy isn't perfect, is it? It's just better than anything else. It's horribly inefficient. Just think of how hard it is to get anything done or for decisions to be made. In fact, the Nephites are going to face some serious challenges to this new government right off the bat with men like Nahor and Amlici. But apparently, democracy is the best alternative that we have. But why? What makes it superior to all the others that have been tried? One of the reasons why is in verses 7 through 8. And now, if there should be another appointed in his stead, behold, I fear there would rise contentions among you. And who knoweth but what my son, to whom the kingdom doth belong, should turn to be angry and draw away a part of this people after him, which would cause wars and contentions among you, which would be the cause of shedding much blood and perverting the way of the Lord, yea, and destroy the souls of many people. Now I say unto you, let us be wise and consider these things. For we have no right to destroy my son, neither should we have any right to destroy another if he should be appointed in his stead. Now, do you get what he's saying there? He's saying, if we give my son all that power, who knows if he'll stay righteous or not? Perhaps it'll go to his head and cause contentions. Power destroys, and we have no right to destroy my son or anybody else we might put in his place. Giving somebody that much power can destroy them. Maybe you've heard the old saying, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. A good example of this is Saul from the Old Testament, who started out so humble and righteous, but power corrupted him. And you're probably also familiar with Doctrine and Covenants 121, verse 39. We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men. As soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. So, you don't have to have a lot of authority for it to corrupt you. You don't even have to have authority. You just need to suppose that you do. Therefore, a good government will always limit the power that goes to any one individual, not only for the governed's sake, but for the sake of the person who has the power. There is compassion in limiting the amount of power that somebody can receive. It needs to be shared. So that's going to introduce us to the first of 5 principles of good government that I see taught here in Mosiah 29 that I'd like to cover with you. So principle number 1 of good government. Good government limits power given to any one individual. Now let's see if you can discover the other 4. Principle number 2. It would make sense that good governments would have good judges and good laws too. So we should elect good judges or leaders that will judge according to the law, wise judges. But what makes a good law? Chapter 29, verse 11. The judges will judge the people according to the law, but later he adds a synonymous phrase, according to the commandments of God. So the closer the laws match the commandments of God, the better the laws are going to be, and the more happy and peaceful we'll be as a society. Now, we're not trying to put church and state too closely together here, but we're trying to establish a principle by which we can determine if a certain law is going to ultimately promote the common good. So good laws will be righteous laws. You have to ask yourself if they make it easier or harder for a person to live the laws of God. There should be a pretty good match between the two. So if there are laws that protect people's lives and property and happiness and help them to be moral and just people, then those would be good laws. But laws that excuse sin or make it easier for people to commit sin are bad laws. For example, sometimes there's laws that make it easier for businesses or individuals to cheat people or to take advantage of them. Sometimes there are laws that allow pornographic, ultra-violent, or explicit material to be protected by free speech laws. I sometimes wonder about those laws. There are laws that are made that make it easier for people to become addicted or to do things that are not good for their spirits. Those laws are bad laws. So principle number 2 is good governments appoint wise leaders that enact laws according to the commandments of God. Principle number 3. If it's not good for any one individual to have that power, then who is given the power in a good government? I mean, you have to give it to somebody, right? What phrase in these verses shows where the ultimate power should come from? And yes, there are judges, but who appoints those judges? The voice of the people. The people are given the ultimate power in choosing who leads them. And that is determined by the majority. But why the majority? I think there's a principle in there. It is not common that the voice of the people desireth anything contrary to that which is right, but more common for the lesser part to desire what's not right. That's why it's unwise to give too much power to one man, as in monarchies, or even a small group of people like an oligarchy, because it's common for the minority to not want what's right. That truth makes me wary of special interest groups, whether they're right-wing or left-wing, because it's common for a small group to get so caught up in their cause that they might do wrong. So if you find yourself in the minority on any certain issue, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong, but it should give you reason enough to take pause and really examine your position. Now, is majority rule foolproof? No, unfortunately it's not. Just take a look at the next verse. And if the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he has hitherto visited this land. So, I guess it's also possible that the majority could end up getting it wrong. But when the majority of the people desire that which is not right, your society is losing its way and moving closer to a fullness of iniquity and therefore destruction. We have many examples of that very thing happening in the Scriptures. So principle number 3, good government operates by the voice of the majority of the people. Principle number 4, what do verses 28 through 29 teach us? And now if ye have judges, and they do not judge you according to the law which has been given, you can cause that they may be judged of a higher judge. And if your higher judges do not judge righteous judgment, ye shall cause that a small number of your lower judges should be gathered together, and they shall judge your higher judges, according to the voice of the people. Well, what governmental principle does that sound like? Checks and balances, right? Don't let any one particular group of your elected officials have too much power. Put checks in place in case that small group gets out of line. This is a major facet of American government. And I suppose that you could also argue that the existence of differing political parties helps to keep things in check and balance on a lot of things as well. Although at the same time, I know they can be very maddening and they can keep things from getting done. But point is, principle number 4, good government employs checks and balances of power. Principle number 5. I see in these next verses a very thought-provoking balance. Balance is an eternal principle, and with government it's no different. So let's imagine a set of scales here. And on one side we're going to place something that I think we can all agree on is a major role of government. To provide the people with what? Look for the answer in verse 32. And that is to create a system that protects the liberty, rights, and privileges of all people. That's the role of good government. Governments that seek to deny people their liberties, their rights, or their privileges is bad government. And I think we could all come up with some examples from the last century of bad governments that have done just that. But there is another principle to consider here. There's more to making our nation work than liberties, rights, and privileges. Those need to be balanced with something on the other side. So let's make a little diagram and put liberties, rights, and privileges on one side. But what lies on the other side of that balance? Mosiah makes an interesting point about being a king. So let's pick it up in verses 30 through 31. And I command you to do these things in the fear of the Lord. And I command you to do these things, and that ye have no king. That if these people commit sins and iniquities, they shall be answered upon their own heads. For behold, I say unto you, the sins of many people have been caused by the iniquities of their kings. Therefore, their iniquities are answered upon the heads of their kings. So, with all that power that's given to kings, there's something else that goes with it. Accountability for the actions of his people. And he continues in verse 33, And many more things did King Mosiah write unto them, unfolding unto them all the trials and troubles of a righteous king, yea, all the travails of soul for their people, and also all the murmurings of the people to their king. And he explained it all unto them. That's fascinating. King Mosiah is basically saying, heavy is the head that wears the crown. If a society goes bad, the king may have to answer for the sins of all those people. The buck stops with the leader. With great power comes great responsibility, right? God apparently holds leaders accountable for how they lead their constituents. King Noah is an example of this. Remember how it was described that he did cause his people to commit sin. They were righteous at first, but because of King Noah's leadership, they became wicked. So King Mosiah says that it's not right that any one man should have that much power or that much liability either. His conclusion, and he told them that these things ought not to be, but that the burden should come upon all the people, that every man might bear his part. So what are we going to put on the other side of this balance? Yes, government should protect our rights and privileges, but what's our part? What do we call every man bearing his part? Responsibility. And since the power is going to lie with the people, therefore, so should all the accountability. Can you see how that balance works? Now look at verse 38 and tell me which phrases fit on which side of that scale. Therefore they relinquished their desires for a king, and became exceedingly anxious that every man should have an equal chance throughout all the land. So which side am I going to put equal chance on? Liberties, rights, and privileges, right? And then, yea, and every man expressed a willingness to answer for his own sins. So where am I going to put that phrase? That goes on the responsibility side. You can also see this balance in Doctrine and Covenants 101, verses 77 to 78. According to the laws and constitution of the people, which I have suffered to be established, and should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles. There's our rights side. That every man may act in doctrine and principle pertaining to futurity, according to the moral agency which I have given unto him, that every man may be accountable for his sins in the day of judgment. That's responsibilities. And then this interesting note here. Therefore, it's not right that any man should be in bondage one to another. So why is slavery wrong? I think that most of us would say that it's wrong because it denies people their rights. And that's true. But there's another reason too. God also doesn't like slavery because it denies people their accountability and responsibility. He can't judge people fairly for their actions if they really had no choice in the matter. So slavery is wrong for both reasons, for both sides of that scale. Now back to Mosiah's people. He's saying, if we're going to give you rights and privileges, then you'd better be willing to do your part and answer for your own sins. In another section of the Doctrine and Covenants that's very political in nature, we've got a warning about this balance. It's in 98 verses 6 through 7. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land. And as pertaining to law of men, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. So in this balance, if you give either side more or less, then that's going to cause your nation some grief. It's going to come of evil. If I were to attach the word more or less to one side or another, our balances are going to get out of order, and we need to keep things in balance. So now, in your nation, if it is out of balance, which side do the scales tip towards? And I know that in my nation, the United States, more and more it seems that people are demanding rights and privileges in an effort to not be accountable for their actions, but to use them as a license for sin. If there are protests, which side do they focus on? Liberties, rights, privileges. We want our rights. Don't step on our liberties. Give us our privileges, our entitlements. And how often have you seen a protest with people yelling things like, give us more responsibility, expect more of us, hold us accountable? You're just not going to see that. No, it's all about rights. Whether it's abortion, drug legality, gambling laws, welfare issues, explicit material in the media, and so on, we've got to consider the other side of the coin. What about our responsibility? Our responsibility to choose good leaders, our responsibility to support our elected leaders, our responsibility to follow and obey good laws, our responsibility to work hard to support our nation, our responsibility to be willing to serve and fight for our liberty, or at the very least, to support those who do. We have a responsibility to be good citizens. The next chapters at the very beginning of Alma really seem to suggest this. The new government in the first part of Alma is going to face some real challenges, and whole groups of people are going to rebel and become prideful and cause problems. But throughout it all, you have descriptions of good people doing good things. So you may not be able to control your fellow man. You may not be able to control your government, but you can control you, even in the worst of political circumstances, whatever country you might be in. No matter how good or bad your leaders are, you can still be a good person and live according to your morals. Unfortunately, more and more societies are becoming obsessed with rights instead of responsibilities. There's a statement that's often attributed to Joseph Smith, though granted, its authenticity is debated, where he was reported to have said that one day the Constitution would hang by a thread. Now, if he did make that statement, perhaps this is what he was referring to, that the scales of good government would skew out of balance, that people would start to apply more or less of some of those principles, tipping so far to the rights and entitlement side that the welfare of our nation could be in jeopardy. So principle number 5, good government encourages a balance between rights and responsibilities. Now, don't misunderstand me. I do love my nation. And in all, even with its problems, I believe that there's far more right with my country than there is wrong. I'm very grateful for the Constitution and the liberties and rights and privileges that my government provides me. But still, I feel we would do well to remember the balance. And before we move on, I want you to consider a few questions. What principles of good government do you see in your nation? And what good has come into your life because of them? What areas in your nation do you find to be out of balance? And is there anything in your power that you could do to help right them? And then probably the most important question, what could you do to more fully bear your responsibilities as a citizen of your nation? And if you'd like some scriptural ideas on what you could do, I encourage you to check out Doctrine and Covenants 98, verses 6 through 11, and also Doctrine and Covenants section 134. You'll find some really great ideas in there. Well, I encourage you to seek that balance within yourself, even if your government struggles with it. I hope that we can all be good citizens, especially as members of the Church of Jesus Christ. May the nations and communities we live in be grateful that we live within their borders. And I hope that we'll always keep in mind the purpose for democratic principles and for our freedoms. I love something that Joseph Smith once said. Be wise. Let prudence dictate all your counsels. Preserve peace with all men. If possible, stand by the Constitution of your country, observe its principles, and above all, show yourselves to be people of God, worthy citizens. I hope we can be worthy citizens. And that completes our study of the book of Mosiah. Such a phenomenal book with so many great discourses and stories and truths. And I hope that your testimony's been enriched and fortified by it like it has mine. But now we're going to begin our journey through the largest book in the Book of Mormon, which surprisingly only covers 39 years of Nephite history. And it's named after Alma the Younger, the first chief judge elected by the people. Now, for these first 4 chapters of Alma, I'm just going to briefly cover some of the history and background of this time period, and then we'll spend the rest of our time on one particular principle that I feel is most relevant and significant in these chapters. In chapter 1, the church faces a major challenge to its authority. We have an encounter with the second Antichrist of the Book of Mormon, a man named Nahor, who teaches the people that everybody is saved no matter what, and that since his ideas were so great, that the people should support him with their money. So you're going to find some valuable teachings on the danger of priestcraft in chapter 1. Well, Nahor is confronted by Gideon, who then Nahor turns on and kills. And since Nahor is guilty of murder, he's executed. But still, his influence has already spread its poison, and there's a contingent of the people that begin to be lifted up in pride. In Alma 2 and 3, we have a major challenge to the government this time. A man named Amlici who wants to be king and get rid of this pesky system of judges that are thwarting his desire for total power. So the Nephites do the democratic thing and take a vote. And the majority of the people say, no, we don't want a king. Remember the principle taught back in Mosiah 29 that it's not common for the majority to choose the wrong thing. But Amlici won't have it. Neither will his followers, and they break off and initiate civil war. And in that civil war, the Amlicites are beaten back. But then they go and they join forces with the Lamanites, and an even bigger war ensues. But with God on their side, even though they're horribly outnumbered, the Nephites win. And Alma even kills Amlici in a sword fight. Some really exciting stuff. And then Alma chapter 4 describes how a greater rift between the righteous and the wicked begins to form in Nephite society, which prompts Alma to give up the judgment seat and devote himself wholly to the preaching of the word, bearing down in pure testimony against them. But I'd like to focus on this Amlici episode for a minute. I feel there's a really powerful principle that is especially vital for the youth to understand. And it all revolves around one particular word. And to introduce you to that word, I'd like to do this brief activity with you. Look at these pictures. Which one of the dog's shadows is the perfect match? And you're probably going to want to pause this for a minute so that you can take a closer look. Which one is it? And the answer is E. It's not A because the nose is turned up in the shadow. It's not B because there's no collar. It's not C because the tongue isn't long enough. And it's not D because there's not a space between the front legs. And it's not E because the tail is too long. So the answer is E. It's kind of a tough one, huh? Well, what about this one? Which picture is different here? Now, take your time. I know how difficult these can be. And the answer to this one is C. And if you look really close, you can see why. See, that cow is standing up on two legs, right? And he has yellow horns. So that's the one that's different, right? How'd you do on that one? Well, all silliness aside here, there's a point that I'm trying to make. The more different the outward appearance is, the easier it is to tell it apart. The more extreme the difference, the easier it will be to differentiate it from other things. But the more subtle the difference, the harder. Extreme, easy, subtle, hard. Keep that in mind during the rest of this lesson. And one more question to consider here. I want you to look up the following verses and find the word that best matches this activity. It's the same word in every verse and will be the focal point of our lesson. Alma chapter 2, verse 11, Alma chapter 3, verse 4, and Alma chapter 3, verse 8. What is that word? And the word is distinguished. To distinguish something is to set it apart, to make it different, to cause it to stand out. We're going to look at a few different groups of people in the Book of Mormon who sought to distinguish themselves and examine how they did it. The first group is a faction of the Nephites that support the desires of Amlici to be their king. They wanted to distinguish themselves, and they do it in two ways. In what two ways did the Amlicites distinguish themselves? In chapter 2, verse 11, and then chapter 3, verse 4. First, chapter 2, verse 11. Now the people of Amlici were distinguished by the name of Amlici, being called Amlicites, and the remainder were called Nephites, or the people of God. So first, they distinguished themselves by taking on a new or different name. They didn't want to be called Nephites anymore. They didn't want to be associated with the people of God. They didn't want to reflect the values of Nephi. So they take on Amlisai's name. That's who they want to be associated with. That's who they wish to support and serve. And then they do something else to distinguish themselves. How do they do it in Alma chapter 3, verse 4? And the Amlicites were distinguished from the Nephites, for they had marked themselves with red in their foreheads after the manner of the Lamanites. Nevertheless, they had not shorn their heads like unto the Lamanites. So they mark themselves with red on their forehead. They change their appearance to send a message to anybody who looks at them. And what was that message? Look in Alma chapter 3, verse 18. Now the Amlicites knew not that they were fulfilling the words of God when they began to mark themselves in their foreheads. Nevertheless, they had come out in open rebellion against God. Therefore, it was expedient that the curse should fall upon them. So, it symbolized rebellion. If you were to walk down the streets of Zarahemla and you saw somebody pass by with a red mark on their forehead, what would you assume about that person? That's an Amlicite. This person is rebelling against our government and our religion. They don't want to be associated with the people of God. They want to distinguish themselves. They want to be separate. Now, there's another group of people in the Book of Mormon that also wanted to distinguish themselves. And they too do it in two different ways. So see if you can find those two ways in Alma chapter 23, verses 16 through 17, and Alma 27:27. And now it came to pass that the king and those who were converted were desirous that they might have a name, that thereby they might be distinguished from their brethren. Therefore the king consulted with Aaron and many of their priests concerning the name that they should take upon them, that they might be distinguished. And it came to pass that they called their names Anti-Nephi-Lehi's, and they were called by this name, and were no more called Lamanites. So this is the group of Lamanites that had been converted by Ammon and Aaron and the sons of Mosiah. And they decide that they need to change something, to change their names, since they've become new people. They want to throw off the name Lamanite and all the connotations of rebellion that went with it. And they call themselves Anti-Nephi-Lehi's, which I know is kind of a confusing name because it sounds like they're against Nephi and Lehi. That's the way we use the term anti. But perhaps anti meant something different in the Nephite language. Or maybe the idea is that they're choosing to stop facing or reflecting the values and traditions of Laman and the Lamanites, but rather they want to turn and face or reflect the values and traditions of Nephi and Lehi. That's who they wanted to be associated with. And so they take those names upon themselves. And you could also cross-reference this idea with Mosiah chapter 1, verse 11, where King Benjamin uses the word distinguished. And moreover, I shall give this people a name, that thereby they may be distinguished above all the people which the Lord God hath brought out of the land of Jerusalem. And this I do because they've been a diligent people in keeping the commandments of the Lord. So they too took on a name. And what was the name that they took upon themselves? Later in Mosiah, they take upon themselves the name of Christ. That's who they wanted to be associated with. That's who they wished to support and serve. Well, the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's distinguished themselves in another way as well. How do they do it in Alma 27:27? And they were among the people of Nephi, and also numbered among the people who were of the church of God. And they were also distinguished for their zeal towards God, and also towards men, for they were perfectly honest and upright in all things, and they were firm in the faith of Christ, even unto the end. So where the Amlicites decided to distinguish themselves with an outer mark, how did the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's do it differently? These are all inner things or qualities of the soul. They were distinguished by their character. So let's create a comparison chart here to see if we can't learn something from all of this. These groups are really great foils to each other. And by the way, if you wished, you could use this handout as an activity if you wanted to help your students discover these principles on their own. And I'll make that available for you for download if you'd like. But it's a quick review. The Amlicites distinguished themselves by changing their name. The meaning was to reflect their commitment to the values of Amlici. The second way was with a red mark. The meaning, rebellion. What was their focus? The outward appearance. And how long did it take to distinguish yourself as an Amlicite? Not long, right? You just go out, you dip your fingers in some red paint, wipe it across your forehead, and boom, you're an Amlicite. And how much effort does that take? Not much. It's quick and easy. And what was the result of those actions? Look in Alma 3:19. Cursed and condemnation. But what about the anti-Nephite Lehi's? They also changed their name. And what was the meaning of that change? They did it to reflect their commitment to the values of Nephi and Lehi. And their second way of distinguishing themselves was through their zeal, their honesty, their faith, or in other words, their character. The meaning of doing that? Devotion to God and to Christ. Where was their focus? Their focus was on the inner beauty, the inward appearance. And how long does it take to distinguish yourself in that way? A long time, right? Maybe even a lifetime to really distinguish yourself by your character. And how much effort does that take? A great deal of effort and many sacrifices. But what was their result in Alma chapter 27, verse 30? In that verse we're told that they were highly favored of the Lord. So really, there's no problem with distinguishing yourself or separating yourself. It's the way that we do it that becomes the issue. And let's liken the Scriptures here. Do people distinguish themselves in the same kinds of ways nowadays? Do people do it the Amlicite way? What are some of the ways that people distinguish themselves by name or by appearance that show that they are rebelling against either the church or society in general? Perhaps they give themselves names. I'm progressive. I'm an intellectual. I'm spiritual but not religious. I'm an ex-Mormon. I'm anti-religion. Or they show their allegiance to a specific group. I'm from a certain gang or a certain social status, or even music preferences can dictate identities and appearance. And then what are some of the marks of rebellion? Sometimes clothing styles can communicate rebellion. Hairstyles, tattoos, piercings, immodesty, the language we use, the places we spend time in, all of these outward things. And of course, a caution here. Just because somebody has a certain hairstyle or a tattoo or a piercing doesn't mean they're bad people. We should reserve our judgment and treat all people well and welcome all. What I'm asking you to do is to look at yourself and determine your own actions and what they're going to be in the future, rather than pointing the finger at others. Are there things that we do that are efforts to distinguish ourselves the Amlicite way? And why do we do these kinds of things? More than likely, it's because we want to stand out. We want to rebel in some way. And like we demonstrated earlier, the more extreme our appearance, the more we're going to stand out. We're trying to communicate something when we do these things. Usually it means that I'm trying to communicate rebellion. Rebellion against the church, my parents, society in general, or even my culture. And really, it doesn't take too much effort or time to do it, does it? If I wanted to distinguish myself like an Amalekite, how long would it take me? No time at all. I could run down to the barber shop, get a certain haircut. I could get a tattoo. I could go buy a certain set of clothes, and then boom, I could totally distinguish myself. In a matter of hours, I could make that change. Or we could be a little more subtle in our appearance, not so extreme. And I believe that God would have us distinguish ourselves like anti-Nephi Lehis, through our character, through the things that are more on the inside, things that require time and effort to develop. And a question for you here. Can you think of anybody that you know who distinguishes themselves like an anti-Nephi Lehi? And how do they do it? For me, I think of the members of my ward. They are anti-Nephi Lehis, and they're a pleasure to lead. I serve with some of the greatest men and women that I've ever met. They have zeal towards God and their fellow man. They're honest. They're firm in the faith of Christ. I want to grow up to be like the members of my ward. They certainly are distinguished. Before we conclude, just a few questions to help you to liken the Scriptures here. Which of the two ways do you seek to distinguish yourself? Are there any Amalekite markings that you need to let go of? And will you? And then, how can you distinguish yourself more like an anti-Nephi Lehi this week? And with that, my friends, especially my young friends, if you want to be distinguished, distinguish yourself by your character. Be an anti-Nephi Lehi, not an Amalekite. And if you want to be distinguished by a name, let it be the name of prophets, or better yet, the name of Jesus Christ. I can promise you that if you do, you too will be highly favored of the Lord. And that's all I have for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it with somebody that you feel it could help. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, get out there and teach with power.